So there's joy in the house of the Lord today. There's also awkwardness in the house of the Lord today, because we're going to be talking about sexuality again today. But really, there's not a more appropriate place that should be discussed. After all, God created it. God designed it. This is our last in our series about this subject. So there may also be relief in the house of the Lord today. I do not know. Let's jump right in. Matthew 5:27, you have heard that it is said, do not commit adultery. In this part of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus contrasting how some of the Ten Commandments and some of the teaching of his day, there were several very high-profile rabbis that the teaching had been out and people adhered to, and everybody knew what they taught, the things that were taught. And so he's contrasting with what they had heard, what had been said, and how it was received, and how it should have been received. So he's contrasting that. You have heard it said, do not commit adultery. How they received this? Well, I'm good then. I haven't committed adultery. Jesus, some of the other things that you said, I may have been a little bit off with those. I may not have quite grasped those. But this one, I feel pretty confident in this. But then Jesus says, but I tell you, everyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Oh. So adultery is just not something that you do in a bed. Adultery is something that you do in your heart. So adultery doesn't just involve your genitals, it involves your mind, your thoughts. So even to think lustfully about another person means that you've broken God's design. So let's back up and get the big picture. What Jesus is saying when he's involved in these Ten Commandments especially, he's not trying to get across that you're capable. If you try hard enough, you keep these commandments, you're capable of living up to God's standards. That's not what he's trying to get across. What he's trying to get across is you're totally incapable of living up to God's standards. So when you hear the commandment, thou shalt not commit adultery, that's not there to say, well, I haven't committed adultery. I'm doing all right. No, the commandment is there to say, that's what I do all the time. My heart always goes there. I'm constantly committing adultery. It's what's going on all the time. And Jesus is saying, yes, you're guilty. This stuff was baked into your heart even before you were born. It was baked into your heart. And so that's going to leave us and leaves everybody with one or two choices. Well, let's put it this way. There's not a person in this room that doesn't need God's grace and mercy in this area of their lives. Okay? Not one. The second thing this also means is there's no room for you to look down on judgment in this area with anybody. Anybody. Because we're all in the same boat. What Jesus is saying here, look, you're all sexual sinners. When God said do not commit adultery, that was not supposed to help you realize how good you were because you didn't do an act. No, it's supposed to help you realize you're all sexual sinners. So you don't look down in judgment upon anybody because we're all in the same boat. The particulars may be different. Some may have this particular sexual sin than others, but basically we're all in the same boat. So there's a story I love. It's a pastor who, and I believe I shared this with this group. I'm not so sure, but anyway, I love the story. So if I did, here it goes again. There's a pastor who wants to go to this sexual addiction group that's meeting in his town because he wants to, what's this all about? Because there's guys in my church that deal with this, and I want to know whether or not to send them here. So he goes in this sexual addiction meeting, and there's a pretty large group of guys there, and one guy gets up and starts to talk. He says, a couple days ago, I was driving past a strip club, and immediately a couple of guys raised their hands. And he goes, that's strange. I mean, that doesn't seem like a place to ask a question just because he drove past a strip club. And then the guy who's speaking, he doesn't really pay much attention to the hands, doesn't focus on the hands and go, oh, do you have a question? He just keeps going. And he said, I turned the car around, drove in the parking lot, and spent 5 minutes trying to decide whether or not I was going to go into that strip club. A few more guys raised their hand. And again, the pastor had the same thoughts. Kind of strange to see people raise their hand at a comment like that. And then he went on. He said, I went in and came back a little over an hour later, got in my car, overcome with guilt and shame, and wondered how could God love somebody like me? And when he said that, almost every hand in the room went up. And so after it was over, the director of the sexual addiction group came to the pastor and was talking to him and says, well, what'd you think? And the pastor said, yeah, I thought it was pretty good. So I was really confused about the hand-raising stuff that went on. And the director said this. He said, look, we have one rule here in our group, that no one struggles alone. If someone is sharing someplace somehow that they struggle, and you struggle in the same area, you raise your hand. No one struggles alone. And we need to be a church full of raised hands, that full of people who say, look, we're not going to let anybody feel like they're struggling alone in this. They're going to have our compassion. That's what Jesus showed to the woman at the well, was compassion. That's what he showed to the woman caught in adultery, was compassion. But there's a couple things that stop that from happening. One of those is blame. Because there's one area where people will play the blame game as well as any other area in their life, and that's with sexual issues. It's not my fault. It's my husband's fault. It's my wife's fault. It's the family I grew up in. It's the environment I was raised in. We're good at playing the blame game. Adam started it, right? Right off the bat, there's Adam. When God says, did you eat that fruit? What's Adam's response? Hey, that wasn't me. It was that woman you gave me. It's all her fault. I saw one satire about this. It said, a study shows that 100% of men would take any fruit given to them by a naked woman. Now, but listen, that backs up my point. A guy would say, look, every guy would do this. This is what every guy would do. Some people don't go in the right place concerning sexual brokenness because it's the blame game. And others, it's not so much what they do, it's how that they're viewed or how that they're seen by others. They should be met with compassion, love, and grace. That's what God did in the garden, right? Gave them animal skins. Gave them prophecy that Satan and sin would be wiped out. And that would be gone one day. But what happens in our culture? A child goes to their parents and confesses some sexual brokenness in their life. And what do the parents say? How could you do that? How could you do such a thing? Is that how you'd want God to treat you? It should be more like, my heart is broken over this, but I'm glad you came to me and we can walk through this together. Is that not what Jesus did? Now, let me just insert here one thing for you guys. Fathers, if your sons have any hope of walking in purity, they need you. They need you. But your daughters need you more. They need that masculine friendship and overseeing and love in their life. And if they don't have that, they'll go somewhere else for that. So here's what's going on. Let's back up to this part of the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus 6 times, he said, but you've heard it said, but you've heard it said, but you've heard it said. 6 times he does that. Because things that they had heard had been received all wrong. Or some of the things they heard may have been misleading. It could have been misunderstood. It just basically, you've got this wrong. And so Jesus wants to correct that. What they had taken wrong, what had been taught them in the wrong way, he wanted to correct that. So that's what he does. He takes a few of the Ten Commandments and he takes some of the modern teachings of his day that the rabbis had taught. And says, but you have heard it said, and you received it this way, but here's the way it actually needs to be received. And I want to sort of do the same thing. Because the church, and this is the reason why a lot of you struggle with sexual brokenness, sexual sin, sexual dysfunction, whatever you want to call it. It's why so many in the church struggle, is because over the years the church has gotten this wrong. And so I want to go through some ways where the church has gotten this wrong and try to make that right. So I want to use that way that Jesus approached that. You have heard it said. First of all, you have heard it said, it's all about your behavior. It's like Pharisees would look at other people and they say, let me see what you do on the outside. They didn't care what was going on in the heart. They just cared about what was going on the outside, what they saw. And so I'm sorry. I'm sorry if the church seemed to make it more about your behavior. It's all about, what you did. As long as you don't go to any R-rated movies, as long as you wear that skirt no more than $1 bill lengths above your knees, as long as when you're going through the mall and you pass the Victoria's Secret, you close your eyes and run fast as you can and get past that place, as long as you do that, you're fine. Because you've been taught it's just all about your behavior. I am so sorry if the church made it more about your behavior than about what you believe. We talked about that a couple weeks ago. I'm so sorry if the church made it over more about what you do and don't do than about your connection to Christ. I'm so sorry if the church focused on the fruit and didn't talk anything about the root. I'm so sorry that the church never said anything about how you need to be led and filled with and walking by the Holy Spirit. I'm so sorry that you are made to try to make to behave a certain way because of guilt and shame, to be guilted and shamed into a certain type of behavior instead of being drawn into walking in purity by the love and the grace and the power of Jesus Christ. You've heard it said. You've heard it said that because you are sexually broken or have sexual sin in your life, that you're like a piece of gum that's been chewed, or you're like a flower that's lost all its petals, or you're like a piece of tape that's been stuck on everything and lost its stickiness, and now you have no value, you have no worth. I'm so sorry of people who may have told you your value depends upon your virginity or your whether or not you're sexually pure or not. I'm so sorry if somebody made you feel like you weren't worthy of God's love in your life anymore, that you were broken beyond repair. I'm so sorry if someone made you feel like because of your behavior that you had forfeited God's blessings on your marriage or future marriage. I'm so sorry if somebody made you feel like you could never be pure or clean again and you just had to sit in church and be ashamed of yourself for the rest of your life. That's anti-gospel. It's God who makes you pure and clean and holy. Your value is not determined by what you do or don't do. Your value is only determined by what Jesus has done for you. And if there's one person in this room that because of their sexual sin can't be clean, can't be holy, can't be pure, there's no hope for any of us. Not a single one of us. That should get an amen, but it didn't. You guys, look, you can't make up if you don't hit it on the mark. It just doesn't have the same effect. All right. Thank you. You have heard it said, marriage is the ultimate. Marriage is the goal. Marriage is sort of like our idol that we all strive for. But Paul said, God has given some the gift of marriage and some the gift of singleness. See, the subtle message of the church is that if you're not married, there must be something wrong with you. You can't be fulfilled. And yet we're all following a Lord who was celibate and single, yet he seemed to be a pretty fulfilled person. So I am so sorry if you heard from the church because you're not married, you're less than. You are not less than. You are not. You have heard it said. That's it. You haven't heard anything said. All right? Because the church for generations has been totally silent on this issue. Completely silent. You may have heard some sermons about homosexuality. But the church hasn't talked about porn, hasn't talked about sexual dysfunction, hasn't even talked about sexual pleasure in marriage. So I'm sorry if the church's silence on addressing even porn in our culture has led you to try and struggle with this all alone. I'm so sorry if the church's silence on sexual issues had led you to believe that sex is somehow shameful. I'm so sorry that because of the church's silence, maybe you were led to go look for answers somewhere else that was not a good place to go, that was destructive in your life. So the bottom line in getting back to Matthew 5:27 and 28 is that God does not only care about your sexual contact with other people, he cares how you think about them. Think of it this way. My Tahoe breaks down or gets in a wreck or something like that and has to be in a shop. And they say it's going to be 2 weeks. You know that means it's going to be at least a month. And so somebody in the church says, Randy, I got this old truck you can borrow. The implications behind that is it doesn't matter how you treat this old truck. You can't hurt it. It doesn't matter if it gets a scratch on there or even if it gets wrecked. You can't hurt it. It may die tomorrow. Not a big deal. It's just no truck, and you can borrow that. Somebody else says, Randy, I got this 71 Hemi Cuda convertible you can drive. Yeah. Anybody watch Miami Vice back in the day? You know what Don Johnson drove? A 70 Cuda convertible. It wasn't a 71, but it was pretty nice. Have you watched shows just occasionally see the cars that they drive? Okay, all right. There are a few more. Okay. I'm not the only one who does it. It's not the only reason, but it's a big reason. Now, which one do you think I'm going to choose? Of course, I'm going to choose a 71 Hemi Cuda convertible. And when I'm driving that thing, I promise you, my defensive driving skills are going to be way up here. I'm looking around. Does anybody even looks close like they may go into my lane and not know it? Or somebody, are they going to turn quick enough? I'm doing something, I'm making sure nobody gets close. And my phone rings or I get a ding for a text, not even looking at that. Don't care who's calling me. I've got to focus on this. And some people treat their sexuality and other people's sexuality like it's just no truck. Doesn't matter what you do with it. You're just exchanging body fluids. No big deal. But God wants us to treat our sexuality like, man, it's so special. We want to be careful. We want to take care of this. And what God is saying, what Jesus is saying in Matthew 5:27, 28, it not only matters how you treat your sexuality, it matters how you treat somebody else's sexuality. See, I would treat driving that Cuda a lot different than I would driving my Tahoe. We miss it though. So we will lust and do other things because we say it doesn't matter how I treat their sexuality, but it does. So I got a video I want you to watch. It's a pastor named Caleb. He's got an interesting background. And it's about 3 minutes long, a little over 3 minutes long. So here we go.
I was 2 years old. My parents got a divorce, and both of them went into same-sex relationships. They were very political activists. They joined the local board of directors of GLAAD. They took me with them when I was very young to gay clubs and bars and pride parades and events and campouts. I remember this one time I was marching this gay pride parade when I was very young, and at the end of the parade were all these Christians holding up signs saying, "God hates you, there's no room for you." And if that wasn't offensive enough, they were spraying water and urine over everyone at the same time. I looked at my mom and I said, "Mom, why are they acting like this?" And I will never forget her words. She said, "Caleb, they're Christians, and Christians hate gay people." And so I really grew up not liking Christians. I judged the whole community based on the extremists of those on the street corners. And I had some friends who were always trying to make me into a Christian. So one of them invited me to a Bible study, and I figured I'd go. My plan is very simple. I'm going to go and I'm going to be a ninja Christian. I'm going to pretend to be a Christian, learn about the Bible, and then dismantle their arguments for Christianity. And I kept on going. I wanted to prove Christianity wrong, but here's what I learned, that Jesus was not like the people on the street corners. That Jesus' life was actually proving my worldview wrong. And I also learned that Jesus had very deep theological convictions, but he also had very deep relationships with people who are not like him and people who are marginalized and outcast and pushed aside not only by secular society, but also by religious society as well. And I gave my life to Christ eventually, and I wanted to become a Christian, and I decided to become a pastor pretty much all within the span of a week. And I remember telling my parents, I was a 16-year-old teenager coming out as a Christian to my 3 gay parents. They disowned me for a while. They kicked me out. They didn't want to have anything to do with me. The same frustration and the same treatment and the same extremism that they feared from the people on the street corners, they gave to me at the same time. I went to Bible college and I said, Lord, if you ever give me the chance to lead a church, I want a church filled with people who are broken, filled with people who are questioning their sexuality, with people who have had abortions, with people who are in gangs and homeless and cutting and clinically depressed, and people who have their finances out of whack and their marriages are destroyed, and people who have ruined relationships with their parents, because that's what the church is. The church is really a mosaic of broken lives that God has united together to glorify himself. Jesus Christ did not die on the cross for some little members-only country club that is really a Pharisee factory. I preached at a church for 3.5 years. Both of my parents, separate of one another, moved down to Dallas, Texas. And they both started attending the church that I was preaching at. These are the same people that would make fun of people on the radio station, and they started attending my church. And the people in my church were nicer to them than I was. And I just think to myself, that's incredible. And it's messy, and there's tension, and it's uncomfortable. And you know what? That's what faith is. Do they believe in Jesus? Yes. Are they saved? Yes. Are they in a same-sex relationship? No. Do they still struggle with same-sex attraction? Probably so, yes. Will they slip up sometimes? I don't know. It's not my job to resolve this tension between grace and truth. It's my job to love people well and point them to Jesus. Because Jesus is all about people. And when Jesus' grace intersects our messy lives, it looks like messy grace. But that's okay, because God loves messy people.
Up there is that he kind of mentioned when his parents came to his church, they were 69 and 70 years old when they became Christians. And he asked them, what made this happen? Why'd you become a Christian? And he said, because people in the church didn't treat us like projects, they treat us like people. They found compassion. They found compassion. And we want to be a place where there's a lot of messy grace that's apparent. Now, don't misunderstand me. It's compassion without compromise. Okay? We do not compromise over sin. Jesus didn't go to the woman caught in adultery and go, oh, your sin, we just won't worry about that. No, sin put him on the cross. You don't compromise that. But we have to do this differently than how we're doing it. There is a tidal wave of sexual brokenness, sin, addiction, dysfunction, and it's not going to get any better. And we have to learn to deal with it differently. We have to let them know that Jesus offers them hope. In fact, those were the first words out of his mouth. Here's what we read in Luke chapter 4. Jesus said, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to set free the oppressed." Jesus said, that's why I'm here. Those who have been held captive, those who are addicted, those who are oppressed, that they can find freedom, they can find hope. So Jesus' approach to people with sinful brokenness was not, oh, you've done this is going to mess you up for the rest of your life. If that was Jesus' message, like I said, there wouldn't be hope for any of us. If Jesus is not good news for any sexual sin or sexual dysfunction, he's not good news for any of it. We all need that. Jesus came to people who were confused to give them clarity. He came to people who were full of guilt to give them grace. He came with people who were lonely to give them intimacy. He came to people who were broken to give them beauty. We looked at this a year or so ago. I just showed you a picture of this. Kintsugi is what it's called. It's called Japanese artwork that started back in the 1500s. They would take a clay pot that was broken, and instead of just trying to cover it up and patch it, they filled in the cracks with gold. So not only did that fix the pot, it made it much more valuable. We're all broken, was the point of do not commit adultery. We all have this in every single one of us are sexually broken. And God wants to come along with his grace and fill in that brokenness and repair it. And when he does, that makes us more valuable. Why? When you look at this, what do you see? You see the gold. When people look at our lives, they're to see the grace. What God has done. That's why Paul said, I am what I am by the grace of God. Because what makes me beautiful, what makes me valuable is God's grace in my life, how he has come to repair that which was sin in my life. And the place we need this more than any other is in the sexual area. We talked about at the very beginning how people were at the edge and just falling off and falling off and falling off in this area. Totally messing up their lives, looking like there's no hope. And we got a world out there that's falling off continually. We got church, inside church, people are falling off all the time. And we have to say, but the grace of God can change. He can put you back together. And you know what? He can make you even more beautiful because it means his grace has touched your life. And what's going to be the most important thing about your life is his grace. What people are going to be drawn to and see is God's grace. But we got to be a people who are as good at this as Jesus was. I mean, Jesus just so beautifully would give compassion without compromise. And we need to be a people who are willing to do that. So, do you need some gold filled in the cracks of your life? Or do you want to just pretend it's not there? Pretend it's no big deal. See, the way that we are to experience that grace and compassion and love, the way that somebody is meant to experience that is through us, God's people. So again, when you see somebody with brokenness, what's your attitude? How could you? Or my heart breaks over what you've done, and I want to walk with you through this. So that when it's all said and done, what people are going to see in your life and be amazed is God's grace. That's what's going to stick out. So we're going to have a hymn of invitation. And maybe you're someone that needs to experience that grace. Maybe you're someone that needs to give it. Maybe you're someone that needs to look with compassion on somebody else and you haven't. Maybe you're ready to become a Christ follower and like Caleb's parents at 79 and 80 said, you know what? We just did nothing but still get this our whole life, but now we want some of that. We want some of that. We've seen what God's grace can do to somebody who's broken, and we want that. We need that. We have to have that. And if that's you, it can start by surrendering your life to Christ. Are you ready to do that? Let's stand together as we sing.